So we're going to, I think, just the best style for this, we're just going to read through the story. We'll probably get through a couple chapters today and just walk through it, talk through it as we go. So in chapter 8, remember, we've had Gideon. God found him at this wine vat, trying to thresh wheat out of sight of the Midians who had come and taken over Israel. Part of the cycles of rebellion against God and God's judgment, oppression, and then grief on the part of the Israelites, and God raises up this judge. This is a common cycle we see throughout the book of Judges. And okay. Yeah, you can. I think you can use headphones as well if you need to hear that. Might.
I just want to make sure that it went through.
Okay, cool. All right. So Gideon, he's called by God. He asks God for multiple tests to make sure that God, even though the angel gave him this message and then went up in a puff of smoke, seems fairly convincing. Gideon's not so sure, so he tests God multiple times with the fleece being wet and the ground being dry, and then the ground being wet and the fleece being dry, and then God starts to test Gideon. He is going to go out to battle with the Midianites, but instead of 30,000 troops, God whittles his numbers down to just 300. They have to go, and Gideon, instead of his men actually doing any fighting, they just bring trumpets and jars and like lanterns, sticks with pitch and fire on them, or torches. And God gives them this great victory where all of the Midianites and their allies basically slaughter each other and flee away. And that's where we find ourselves here at the beginning of chapter 8, as Gideon and his men are pursuing the Midianite army across the Jordan. So it says, the men of Ephraim said to him, "What is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they accused him fiercely, and he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer?" So he's saying, isn't the scraps left at the end of your harvest better than the full crop of my tribe, my city? So he's saying, we're nothing. You guys are great, you're amazing, you're cool, you're talented, you've got everything, and we're nothing. Why are you making an issue out of this? God has given into your hand the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. So he's diffusing their fury at not being included in the victory that they thought they should have been included in. Notice they're asking him this, though, after the victory. It's, strange how hindsight is 20/20. And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted, yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." And the officials of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" They're like, we want to wait and see who's going to actually win this battle before we decide who to support. You don't want to be caught. Notice the skepticism in their answer. They have no trust for God. They're just seeing this as a political action. They don't see it as something that God is actually helping Gideon win the battle. So they're just like, if this goes badly for you in the end, we don't want to be seen as anybody who is aiding and abetting rabble-rousers or terrorists or people who are not supporting this massive power that's been oppressing us. So their response is very skeptical. There's no trust for God. So Gideon said to them, verse 7, "Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." Yeah, nice. And from there he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, "When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower." Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men. So they had about, well, it's going to explain, they had 135,000 men to begin with. 120,000 of these have already been killed. So Gideon initially, in the last chapter, when he defeats the Midianites, he's going with 300 men against 135,000 men. Now most of those have died in the melee. So the 15,000 were all of whom were left of the army of all the people of the east, for there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogbehah, actually probably Jogbehah, fun names, and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the panic by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him. And he wrote down for him the officials and the elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, "Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted?' And he took the elders of the city and took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city." Meditate on that story for a second. I mean, we're reading this, and this is the stuff that so much of the Old Testament is made up of. And you're going, what's the point, God? Like, what is the story even about? Why did God feel like this needed to be preserved so that thousands, like 3,500 years later, we in the 21st century can be reading back about Zebah and Zalmunna and the men of Succoth and the Tower of Penuel? What does this have to do with anything? I think, well, I have some ideas, but I'm curious from you guys. What do you think, as part of our job, I think, as we're studying the Bible together as individuals, as families, as a church, we want to be able to take stories like this and understand what is God trying to teach us in this story? How do we think through a story like this? And we'll continue, but let's take a second. I want to hear from you guys. What do you think matters about this story? How is it relevant to us in the 21st century? What does it teach us? Yeah. It definitely shows us Gideon's continuing obedience and trust in God. Very good. I think any story in the Bible that you look at is, there's a good example of this. A lot of people like the story of Esther. What's interesting is in the book of Esther, God is not named. It's a very secular book, and in fact, some people disputed whether it was inspired by God at one point, the Old Testament rabbis, because it says nothing about God. But what you have to understand in Esther, as well as in a story like this, is God is undergirding everything that's happening in the story. So when you come to a story like this that doesn't have the principles just on the surface, where it's easy to see, oh, this is what I need to take away from this story, which honestly, a lot of Old Testament stories, the principles are not right at the top. You have to dig a little bit to understand what we can take away from these sections of the Bible. But two things that you want to ask right away. What does this story teach us about God's character? What does this story teach us about God's character? And secondly, what does this story teach us about messy humans and their attempts to follow God? For good or bad. Sometimes it's not perfect responses, as we're going to see later in the chapter. But I think bringing those two questions to any text in the Bible, especially any narrative story in the Bible, will help make sense of otherwise fairly confusing and obscure stories. What else? Either using those two questions or others, what else could we pull out of what's here in the story that we've read so far? Is there anything else that we should take away?
Well, I would say that there are consequences to not trusting and believing in God.
Exactly. Yes. That too. Sometimes you're getting whipped by thorns into the wilderness. Yeah. That's honestly one of the big ones I was thinking of. That's a good principle. You guys have covered the two big ones that I saw in this text. Are there any others that are questions or comments on this section that we've covered so far? So we've read the first 12 verses of Judges 8. Okay. Let's continue then, and we'll be able to keep talking about it as we go through. So picking up in verse 13. Verse 18. We've gone through verse 17. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" They answered, "As you are, so are they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." I guess here they're trying to butter him up a little bit, which doesn't work super well. And he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise and kill them." But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Actually, the Hebrew it's a little bit vague on ages. They weren't as specific as we are. Probably boy, maybe. Not quite sure. The Hebrew is vague. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as a man is, so is his strength." This is a different culture than we live in, guys. And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. Oof. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Good job, Gideon. But we're going to keep reading and see it doesn't quite work that way. And Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil. for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they said, "We will willingly give them." And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that was requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all of Israel whored there after it. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now, Gideon, and by the way, Jerubbaal and Gideon are the same person. There's some narrative reasons why they use different names, but same guy. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. He's going to become an important character later. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good he had done to Israel. Oof. Tough story. It seemed like it was going so well at the beginning. And I think, well, let's talk, we're going to try to go a little bit further today into what some of his sons do. But again, it's important to pause here and think about, I think one of the key maybe takeaways right away, just on the surface of the story as we've read it now through the end of chapter 8, is a good start doesn't mean a good finish. He was doing so well. He's followed God. He's mostly been really trusting and faithful. But at the end of the story, once he's won the victory, he goes and makes this ephod that becomes an idol to Israel. Go ahead, Claudia. An ephod is like a staff that the priest would have held as kind of a symbol of their priestly calling. Good question. Because they didn't really believe in God and they were looking for something tangible and physical to worship. Yeah.
It became a symbol of power.
Right.
Whoever had the staff had the power.
Exactly.
And so kind of like in the Catholic Church, like the Pope is venerated or Mary is venerated because they have power, rather than venerating God, who actually gives people power.
Exactly.
And so it was an easy transition to go from the person with the staff to, oh, here's another thing that has power, so I'm going to worship this now.
Yeah. Exactly. And in their culture, in the cultures around them, they're used to people worshiping physical objects. We don't think about it as much because it's not our culture. Our culture is to worship security, health, money, entertainment, and freedom. That's our culture. Those are our idols. Maybe a few more. But their culture is used to taking a little block of wood or a stone and worshiping it. It's interesting. I was reading Deuteronomy yesterday and I noticed something I'd never quite seen before in the text. God multiple times says throughout Deuteronomy, I'm your rock. I'm your fortress, your place of security. And he uses this word rock, which we also see in the Psalms quite regularly. But then there's this connection where a few verses later, after saying, I'm your rock, he says, don't you dare go worship these idols made out of rock and stone and wood and gold and silver. So it's interesting the parallels that God is setting up, where he's saying, I'm the true rock that's going to protect you and secure you. But these rock statues, if you go and commit idolatry with them, well, good luck. When you're calling on them and they are your refuge, it's not going to work. And so he's setting up this contrast between his real power versus these pieces of stone or wood that have no power.
Yeah, and at this point in their history, they still had not taken the entire promised land.
Right.
So they were still living with, even with, marrying into all the other cultures.
Yeah.
And that brought all of their gods into it. Together.
Right.
They're praying to God for good harvest, and they're praying to this other guy for good harvest.
Yeah, cover all your bases. Yeah, which is exactly what God had warned them of in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, and really throughout their wilderness wandering years. From the very beginning, God's telling them, you need to destroy the peoples around you, because otherwise they're going to seduce you into following their own idolatrous rituals. And that's exactly what we see happening.
That's probably why all the people with had to be put down. They were looking at their tower as their accomplishment, as their rock.
Right.
They're standing in the world, and none of those. If they would have survived, they would have spread that sacrilege throughout the rest of Israel too. So their family line was kind of cut down.
Exactly.
It's hard to see it as a mercy, but it is a mercy. Because it even says that they don't kill the men. They didn't kill the children, they didn't kill the children.
Right.
Because the men are the ones who are passed down the tradition, who have taught their children that they are great with their power.
Right.
So now the children and women will probably get absorbed into another tribe or another city where they worship God properly, they would have praised them so that their children would be able to do that. It's hard, like I said, it's hard to see it as mercy, but sometimes God killed entire cities as a mercy to the children.
Yeah.
Be raised and taken care of better.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's take, kind of as we're stopping here at the end of chapter 8 for now, let's take, given that we don't live in a culture that worships golden ephods or stone idols, how do we apply this story into our own lives? What is God trying to say to us today?
Well, I think now's a great example of this. Where is our security right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we've got disease running rampant throughout the country, people are losing their jobs,
Right.
people are losing their families, and people are just trying to grab onto any little thing that they possibly can.
Yeah.
And sometimes God's plan involves losing things, losing your entire life.
Right.
If we look at Abraham, for example, God said, leave your family and go to this place that you've never seen before,
Right.
hundreds of miles away, and just go and trust me.
Yeah.
How difficult would that be for someone today if God's told us to leave everything that we have, leave your job,
Right.
leave your family, go to a different state, go to a different country, do something completely different out of your comfort zone, and just trust that everything's going to be okay without seeing anything.
Right.
And unfortunately, our culture is going to scrape and grasp any little tiny thing that they possibly can that they understand as security.
exactly. We put our trust in our medical system, in our jobs. Yeah, go ahead, Claudia. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Beatrice that if God called me, I don't know what I like well. But somebody like Jerry service that they've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
God knows who he was.
Yeah. Being willing to give up everything. And I think looking at missionaries and what they've done is a very healthy example. Early in the pandemic, I read a biography on Adoniram Judson, who was one of the first missionaries in Burma, actually one of the first American missionaries to go anywhere. And he went out and served as a translator, missionary, preacher in a very, very hostile country for decades, pretty much the rest of his life. He left in his 20s and had 2 of his 3 wives died in the field just because of tropical illnesses or other things. But I think often, to our own cost, we in America make too hard of a distinction between missionaries who travel to another country and our own lives. And we have this mentality that's very unhealthy that says their job is to go and risk and be immersed in another culture and build relationships with people who don't know Christ. My job is just to do my normal job, work, maybe support them financially, which is great, live in our own circles and just maybe write them letters occasionally, host them when they come over on furlough, but not much else than that. And really, people here have to understand our city is one of the most secular cities in the world. Our city, if you look at the statistics, like Pew Research Center and others have done the numbers, our city, our area, this Puget Sound, Seattle area, there's about 2%. There's about 10% who would claim to be Christians. There's about 2% who actually go to a gospel preaching church. 2% of your neighbors actually go to a gospel preaching church. We are called to be missionaries. We may not have to go live in a bungalow and eat on a dirt floor with like chickens cackling around us. Or never forget one time when I was in Indonesia, I went on a summer mission trip when I was 19, and they had this bus that's like the size of a minivan. And they packed like 30 people in there. And after that, and you've got chickens on the back, the whole bit. After that, we had to stop, and we're like, there's no social distancing there. There's no personal bubble. It was fantastic. But we're sitting there like kids on laps and and everybody crammed in there like a bunch of sardines. And this oven repairman gets on with all his wares. So we're like crammed knee to knee, hardly any space. And he's coming with like this pile of stove pieces trying to jostle to the back. I mean, just that kind of craziness. We don't have to live like that. We get to get in our air conditioned cars with our radio and go on our merry way doing our job. And we live a very comfortable life. And it's not to say that that's bad, but if that comfortable life keeps you from building relationships with unbelievers in our city, then we are failing to follow the calling that God has given us. We can't think of missionaries in a us versus them terms, where it's we stay here and live our cozy life and they go to Africa or Thailand or some other place and do missionary work. God has called us to do missionary work, and we live in a city where missionary work is eminently necessary. Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox, but just laying that out there. I think it's important. So be careful not to build gold ephods with the earrings of the people that you take in battle, but because I don't think any of us are going to struggle with that. The real application is don't worship the same gods as the rest of the culture. Don't let the idols of our culture, again, security, comfort, entertainment, health, wealth, those are the gods of our culture. Don't let those gods get in the way of you doing what God has called you to do. I think that's the real application of this story for us. That and finish strong. Finish strong. Any questions or comments on this section before we move on to chapter 9? Okay, let's jump down to chapter 9. Now we're going to learn about Abimelech, Gideon's son. And remember how, this is interesting and a teensy bit speculative, but remember how Gideon said he wasn't going to become king? Abimelech in Hebrew means the king is my father. Abi, father, so Abraham, that Ab name, Abraham means father of many nations. Here, Abbe means my father, and then Melech is king. And so his name means my father is the king. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem, and notice the name change. They're not calling him Gideon anymore. They're calling him Jerubbaal. That's significant. He went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, "Say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh." And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, "He is our brother." And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal Berith. So this silver is coming from this idol that they've set up. Out of the house of Baal Berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. You thought it couldn't get worse. It's going to get worse. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all Beth Millo. They went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. So he's being made king at this idol, oak and pillars. That's code words or euphemisms for idols at Shechem. When it was told Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim. Now Mount Gerizim is one of the two mountains that Moses had the Israelites stand on, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, when they pronounced the blessings and the curses. These are the blessings if you follow God. These are the curses if you don't follow God. So it has a ton of theological significance. But this is where he's going and standing. So he stood on the top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, "Listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you." Now he's going to tell us a parable, our favorite form of biblical literature, right? The trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, "Reign over us." But the olive tree said to them, "Shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored, and go hold sway over the trees?" And the trees said to the fig tree, "You come and reign over us." But the fig tree said to them, "Shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit, and go hold sway over the trees?" And the trees said to the vine, "You come reign over us." But the vine said to them, "Shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men, and go hold sway over the trees?" Then all the trees said to the bramble, "You come reign over us." Feels slightly like modern politics. And the bramble said to the trees, "If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." Now therefore, and here we get to the point. Now therefore, if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as his deeds deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of Midian, and you have risen up against my father's house this day. So he's not quite as objective as he sounded when he started the parable. Now he's getting into the polemic part. You have risen up against my father's house this day and killed his son, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female servant. Some stepbrother issues here. King over the leaders of Shechem, because he is your relative. If you then have acted in good faith and integrity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, and this is code for you haven't, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech. So Abimelech in the parable is the bramble. Let fire come out from Abimelech, and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo, and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there because of Abimelech his brother. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, and God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. And the leaders of Shechem dwelt treacherously with Abimelech, that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood be laid on Abimelech their brother who killed them, and on the men of Shechem who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. And the leaders of Shechem put men in ambush against him on the mountaintops, and they robbed all who passed by them along the way. And it was told to Abimelech. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his relatives, and the leaders of Shechem put confidence in him. And they went out into the field and gathered the grapes from their vineyards and trod them and held a festival. And they went into the house of their God and ate and drank and reviled Abimelech. It's not getting any better, guys. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech, and who are we of Shechem, that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, and is not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him? Would that his people were under my hand. Then I would remove Abimelech. I would say to Abimelech, increase your army and come out to him." I get this picture in my head of this moment. They're all kind of drunk. having this party around their idol. And now Gaal is making these pompous boasts about Abimelech. He's a little bit drunk, maybe more than a little bit drunk. He's like, let me at him, I got this. But we'll see what happens to him. Verse 30, when Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled. And he sent messengers to Abimelech secretly, saying, behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his relatives have come to Shechem, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now therefore, go by night, you and the people who are with you, and set an ambush in the field. Then in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, rise early and rush upon the city. And when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you may do to them as your hand finds to do. So Abimelech and all the men who were with him rose up by night and set an ambush against Shechem in 4 companies. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entrance of the gate. Notice how proud this man is. He's watching this army come, and he's just swaggering, standing in the entrance of the gate. Like, come at me! You think you're so strong, Abimelech? And when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, look, people are coming down from the mountaintops. And Zebul said to him, you mistake the shadow of the mountains for men. So Zebul here is being a bit sneaky. He is trying to hide the fact that there's actually enemies coming. Gaal spoke again and said, look, people are coming down from the center of the land, and one company is coming from the direction of the diviner's oak, another idol. Then Zebul said to him, where is your mouth now, you who said, who is Abimelech that we should serve him? Are not these the people whom you despised? Go out now and fight with them. He's taunting him. And Gaal said to the head of the leaders, and Gaal went out at the head of the leaders of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. And Abimelech, let's see here. And Abimelech lived at Arumah, and Zebul drove out Gaal and his relatives so that they could not dwell at Shechem. On the following day, the people went out to the field, and Abimelech was told. He took his people and divided them into 3 companies and set an ambush in the fields. And he looked and saw the people coming out of the city. So he rose against them and killed them. Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, while the 2 companies rushed upon all who were in the field and killed them. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He captured the city and killed the people who were in it, and razed the city and sowed it with salt. Now at this point in the story, you're going, wait, who's the good guy here? Think about who in this chapter, in chapter 9, who's the good guy? Who's the hero? Who's God's man that's going to come and save Israel? Is it Abimelech? Is it Gaal? Is it Jotham? Yeah, exactly. In this gang of assassins, who are we supposed to root for here? So he razed the city and sowed it with salt. Verse 46, when all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard it, they entered the stronghold of the house of El Berith, God of Berith. Abimelech was told that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together, and Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bundle of brushwood and took it up and laid it on his shoulder. And he said to the men who were with him, "What you have seen me do, hurry and do as I have done." So every one of the people cut down his bundle and following Abimelech, put it up against the stronghold, and they set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. Then Abimelech went to Thebez and encamped against Thebez and captured it. So Abimelech just seems to be doing better and better, and yet he's probably the worst of the lot. Not following God, leading the Israelites into more and more sin, just a villain of the worst caliber. And yet he's getting these victories. So he's going up, he encamped against Thebez, verse 50, but there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women and all the leaders of the city fled to it and shut themselves in. And they went up to the roof of the tower, and Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it, and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man and his armor-bearer and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, 'A woman killed him.' And his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw Abimelech was dead, everyone departed to his home. And God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of all the men of Shechem return on their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal." Wow. This is kind of a story that goes from bad to worse. And I intentionally read through it without a lot of comment because I think the principles are better seen in the larger story of both of those chapters put together, read together. I mean, you can kind of parse verses and talk about geography or talk about some of the historical facts behind it. But more practically, as we think through these two chapters, we see Israel in a really bad state, where its leaders are pathetic. They're villains. They're idolaters. They don't care anything about God. And I think as we try to kind of think through what application do we take out of this section of the Bible, really rough section about a lot of messiness and brokenness. One connection that's worth making, this story of Abimelech being crushed by the upper millstone, it's a story that David references when he sends his captain to have let's see here, get the names right. He sends Joab to have the white, I'm blanking on the names. Anyways, I'll come up with it later. I'm blanking on it. Anyways, I think the significant takeaway from this story is that there are bad times in the world. This is a bad time for Israel. You don't see a lot of holy people following God in this moment. And in this moment, we have to contrast it with books like Ruth. I think as we read through Judges, this is the same moment that the story of Ruth is happening. So you have Ruth and Naomi, they leave the land because of a famine, and they go get married in Moab, or their husbands with Naomi leave the land. And they get married to Moabites, their husbands die. Naomi brings Ruth back to the land. And she is a sign of faithfulness to Boaz. But what is happening around them? So you've got this fantastic love story of faithfulness to God, and they're the ones that David will come through ultimately. They're ancestors to David and ultimately ancestors to Christ. So you have this beautiful story, but it's taking place in the midst of events like this. We don't know the exact date of Ruth, but Ruth is happening during the timeline of Judges. And so I think the takeaway for us is we live in times like this. We live in times like this. We look at the world around us and see rebellions, looting, rioting, racism, pandemic, inept leadership. It feels like we're watching the world burn around us in some ways. We're looking towards a political election that, frankly, there's very little hope that we'll see any positive change in, no matter who wins. And a lot of us are left going, we have to pick among a group of assassins and villains. I mean, who do you want? They're all immoral, ungodly people who care nothing about the church or God's vision of what ethics should look like. And we can look at that and feel hopeless, and we can look at a story like this and feel hopeless, but I think where we get our hope has to be recognized in the midst of these times where it seems like nothing good is happening. This is precisely when God is bringing Ruth to meet Boaz, to have a baby who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David, who is an ancestor of Christ. And as we look at a lot of fear and a lot of terror in our world, recognize God is still working in the midst of that. It may not be visible on the political stage or the economic stage, but God is using places like this church, people like you, faithful Christians, to continue to build his church. And that's more important than the brokenness and messiness on the political or kind of power public stage that we end up kind of obsessing over on the news. So don't give up hope. Know that God is working even in the midst of really broken times, both in the times of the judges as well as in our own time. Let's pray. God, thank you for your faithfulness to us. I pray that we would just trust in you more than Gideon all through our lives. We wouldn't let pride and success go to our heads. We wouldn't be the cause of stumbling in other people's lives, even by things that we thought were perfectly innocent. And as we look at the world around us and see a lot of anarchy and villainy, a lot of brokenness, where it seems like there's no heroes, there's nobody who even by any stretch of the imagination we can try to claim as God-fearing leaders that we can rally behind. that you are continuing to build your church. And you've called us to faithfulness among our neighbors and among our family and in our church, regardless of what happens politically. I pray that you would help us not to be dominated by fear and fury over what may happen around us in the world, but we would trust you and grow to love each other more as believers. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.